The last item we want to talk about in the autonomous access point world is IPv6. Why talk about it here and not in the other sections? We have controllers, iOS XE, and AirOS, and in Flex Connect mode, and we also have Meraki, and we don't talk about IPv6 there. So why here? Well, for a few reasons. One of them is that autonomous access points are layer 2 devices, so it's interesting to know what IPv6 is doing in the autonomous world, which are supposed to be layer 2 devices. So what is IPv6 doing here? We'll come back on that in a second. The second is to remind you that in the CCNA wireless exam, you're supposed to know IPv6. So you're supposed to have basic awareness on how IPv6 addresses are constructed, locally significant addresses, global addresses, multicast addresses, etc. So if you have forgotten from your CCNA routing and switching about IPv6, now is a good time to brush up and go look online. There are many tutorials about basic IPv6 addressing scheme. You need to know those. You need to be comfortable with those. IPv6 addresses are present in every Cisco devices, on controllers, and also on autonomous access points. And surprisingly so, because they're layer 2 devices, but if you think about it, the IP address that the access point has is IPv4. So if it has an IPv4 address, why wouldn't it have an IPv6 address? So autonomous access points support IPv6, not so much for the clients because they're just going to breach whatever is coming at layer 2, so the IP layer doesn't matter, but also for themselves. So if you go to network configuration, you may remember that page. We defined the IPv4 address. And here for IPv6, you can as well define IP addresses. And you can define up to 8 IPv6 addresses. Define one, click apply, define the next one, again and again and again, up to 8, as many as you need. And if you go back to the summary page, those IPv6 addresses are going to show in the summary of your access point configuration. So this is for the access point itself, IP address, but every service you define on the access point as well can be defined using IPv4 or IPv6 addresses every time there is an address. So Radius servers, for example, we used IPv4 before for ICE and the access point itself. You can use IPv6 addresses to point to a Radius server. And this is true for Radius. This is true for everything that requires you to configure an IP address on the access point so that it can communicate with any other device in the network. The autonomous APs have full IPv6 support. The only thing you may want to be aware of, and that's, by the way, way beyond CCNA, so you don't have to remember that if you don't want to. We talked before about the roaming at layer 2 between access points in the autonomous world. And we said that if you do so, you have to define one of these access points as being the repository for the credentials, and we named that function Wireless Domain Services, WDS. And we said that if you want to enable that function, WDS has to be configured typically on one of the access points. What you have to keep in mind is that if you use IPv6, you have to make sure that all the access points between which you are going to roam also have an IPv6 address. The reason why is because the way fast transition and 11R is going to be designed is that there will be a mobility domain information element that will define the roaming domain between the access points. That is going to be controlled by a WDS, and that domain is going to be derived from the WDS IP address. So if the IP is IPv6, it's going to be derived from the IPv6 address. And if you move to an access point that has an IPv4 address only, it's going to see that hash coming from WDS and not recognize it. So in short, if you use roaming and WDS in your autonomous network, then you have to make sure that all the APs in that roaming domain have the same level of IP address, IPv4 and IPv6, or only IPv4. But not a mix of some APs having IPv6 addresses and some others in the same fast roaming domain having IPv4 addresses. That is not going to work. But again, this is way beyond CCNA, it's just for your own knowledge. All right, that is the autonomous world. Let's move on.